Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So now that we've investigated the different causes of the hyperinflation crisis in 1923, we've got to now explore the impact it had both on Germany as a country, but also psychologically on the German people. So firstly, we should ask, what is the hyperinflation crisis? What did it actually mean? Well, I've got a story to show you that's behind me. Two women were going to the bank with a washing basket filled with notes, with cash. They passed a shop and saw a crowd standing around the window, so put down the basket for a moment to see if there was anything that could be bought. Then they turned around and found that all the notes were there, untouched, but the basket had gone. Now, it's difficult to believe that such a theft actually happened, but it did in Berlin in 1923. It happened because the German people had lost all confidence in their currency. Monetary systems are based on this confidence. And in Britain today, for example, you can be confident that a £10 note will be accepted in a shop in return for a purchase. Both you and the shopkeeper might only hand over what you want if you offer him more paper money. So in effect, the price goes up. Once confidence in a currency is lost, its value plummets and inflation soars. And this is what happened in Germany in 1923. During the hyperinflation crisis, money lost its meaning as prices soared to unimaginable levels. And printing presses worked continuously to keep banks supplied with worthless paper money. You can see someone with a wheelbarrow of money behind me. You can see someone using cash as fuel to put into a fire. You can see here children playing with blocks of cash as a kind of in a playground as a form of entertainment. And then we also have to my right there, someone using cash as wallpaper. That is the extent of the value of this paper, that it is being used to adorn people's walls in their houses. I mean, quite remarkable. And by November, the German mark was completely and totally worthless as confidence in the economy collapsed. Now, you may or may not have seen a £50 banknote before in the UK. It's quite rare and few people would ever really carry it on them. But it is the banknote with the most monetary value in the UK, £50. Now, before the war in Germany, the highest denomination was 1,000 marks. And this was probably the equivalent to approximately 50 British pounds. Yet, at the peak of hyperinflation in Germany, banknotes like the one behind me were created and circulated, a note for 100 trillion marks. This was the highest denomination of banknotes that were issued by the Reichsbank in 1924, or the end of 1923, moving into 1924, 100 trillion marks, one banknote. Yet these notes were only worth approximately £5 sterling, or 24 US dollars. So completely and utterly valueless. And workers collected their wages and salaries in wheelbarrows and shopping baskets and tried to spend their money immediately before prices rose even further, because prices were rising between 20 and 100% in a day. And inflation was so extreme that at one stage, a single egg cost 80 million marks and a glass of beer cost 150 million marks. Now, the rising prices of food had some serious effects. Food began to run short as farmers hoarded supplies in anticipation of higher prices in the future, and as also they were unwilling to sell food for such worthless money. So in many areas, this led to breakdown in law and order. There were food riots where crowds looted shops. Gangs of city dwellers also traveled to the countryside to actually take food forcibly from the farms, but were confronted by angry farmers determined to protect their own livelihoods. So conflict started there. There was a large increase in the number of convictions for theft, And people also started to have to barter, using bartering their possessions in exchange for vital supplies, using things like coal or sausages even as a form of currency, and swapping those items in order to get what they needed. Now, you're probably used to being told by governments that inflation is disastrous and unrelenting for everyone involved. However, many Germans actually benefited from the collapse in the value of the mark. And these people included those in debt, such as mortgage holders, who could now pay off their loans with devalued currency. Black marketers bought up food stocks and sold them at vastly inflated prices. Thirdly, many entrepreneurs with access to cheap credit, especially via the Reichsbank, used loans to extend their holdings and then easily repaid the loans when their income had increased in money terms. People who rented property with long-term rents gained as well, as the real value of their rents, of the rents they were paying, fell. Owners of foreign exchange and foreigners living in Germany who converted their money into millions of marks also greatly benefited. Also, exporters gained from the mark's falling exchange rate. And finally, in the countryside, farmers coped well since food was in high demand and money was less important in rural communities. Now, one of these winners was Hugo Stinnes. And under the Second Reich, Stinnes owned businesses in the coal, iron, and electrical industries. And despite his conservative views, he compromised during the revolution and granted workers more rights and became a DVP, which is the German People's Party, deputy member of the Reichstag. And as inflation increased, Stinnes used his ties with the Reichsbank to gain cheap credit to buy up struggling competitors. He also converted foreign currency gained from selling his products abroad into millions of marks to expand and re-equip his plant. He also paid off loans in near valueless marks. And by 1924, he was known as the King of the Ruhr, owned 1,535 companies, which was an estimated 20% of Germany's industries, covering coal mines, steelworks, paper mills, chemical concerns, newspapers, hotels, land, and shipping lines. I mean, he did everything. His wealth in the midst of despair aroused great resentment, and his economic power was matched by his political ambitions. The American Assistant Secretary of State, Castle, described him as the strongest man in Germany and one of the most dangerous men in the world. This is because he hoped to support a dictator capable of, as he quoted, speaking the language of the people, who would defeat Bolshevism and restore Germany to greatness. Now, Stinnes died in 1924, but his vision was supported and taken on by other industrialists following in his wake. And after his death, his industrial empire did collapse, but his legacy lived on. However, for the majority, hyperinflation was catastrophic. And the greatest losers were those relying on welfare support, investments, or savings, especially many pensioners who lived off fixed interest investments. And among these were students, the retired, and the sick. Pensioners suffered as the value of their hard-earned savings disintegrated. Those who had patriotically purchased war bonds with fixed rates of interest found their investments and the interest paid lost almost all their value. Those relying on welfare benefits and landlords receiving fixed rents found the value of their incomes fall. By 1923, the cost to a landlord of one window replacement might actually be greater than all the rents received in the entirety of the previous 10 years. So a huge change there. Workers initially secured compensatory wage rises, but these lagged behind rising prices. And so standards of living started to decline. Of this group, the unskilled and those who didn't belong to trade unions probably fared the worst. It's been estimated that unskilled workers probably lost about 30% of their spending power between 1913 and September 1923. Civil servants also, who initially made gains in 1920 to 22, found their real income declining again. And by 1923, there was also an increase in unemployment and short-time working. At the end of the year, only 2.9% of the workforce was actually fully employed. Furthermore, artisans and small business owners, who are known as the Mittelstand, which means kind of middle rank, were badly hit. This was a large, diverse social group, including small farmers, small shopkeepers, and artisans. And without steady sources of income, they felt themselves to be vulnerable to inflation and tended to look to governments to protect their position. Their costs rose, and the prices they charged couldn't keep pace with the inflation. They also paid a disproportionate share of taxes as well. And finally, the sick were badly hit. The costs of medical care increased, while the rapid rise in food prices led to widespread malnutrition. Death rates in large cities also increased. So these were the main groups of winners and losers from hyperinflation, and the effects of hyperinflation varied between different classes and geographic regions. Nevertheless, it was an unreal time which left many people uncertain about what the future might hold. Many, but not all, middle-class people became impoverished, and as a result were left with a sense that they had suffered the most. These people have grown up believing in hard work, thrift, and saving for the future, only to find their savings wiped out and their comfortable lifestyles destroyed. Now, there's one area we've got to be careful on, and that's generalizing about the different classes. And the historian Puckett in 1991 has warned against a kind of simple class-based generalizations, such as the destruction of the middle class from the hyperinflation crisis. And what he says is, two individuals from the same broad social class might be affected very differently, depending on the precise period in question, the part of the country in which they lived, and also their exact role within the fabric of the economy. Indeed, it was precisely through the confusion experienced by individuals and their fears for their social status that the real psychological impact of the inflation made itself felt. A profiteering ethic became common among people who had previously prided themselves on their rectitude, meaning good behavior, and others turned to crime out of sheer hardship. The shifts in the relative standing of the different social groups made individuals uncertain about their social status. So what he's saying there is that there is actually it's far more intricate and complex than making broad statements about the upper class, the middle class, or the lower class. And we've got to really take in lots of multiple different variants and different varying factors there. Now, the inflationary crisis, a long time in the making, was actually solved remarkably quickly, because in November 1923, the new Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, took decisive action to restore confidence in the currency. He appointed the expert financier Hjalmar Schacht to the Reichsbank, and one Rentenmark replaced 1,000 billion paper marks, or 1 trillion paper marks. And the supply of new currency was also strictly limited to 3,200 million Rentenmarks, which means they were going to cap the amount that they were going to print of this new currency. The new currency was quickly accepted, and in November, the weekly Berliner newspaper cost 1 billion marks. However, by December, it only cost 20 pfennigs. So the government showed its determination to prevent a recurrence of inflation by cutting expenditure, partly, which was achieved partly also by dismissing many civil servants, something that they'd been, resistant or reluctant to do previously. So what were the effects of the inflationary crisis? Well, it had a major economical, social, political, and psychological effect, some of which left deep scars that helped to explain the eventual collapse of the Republic. Most Germans suffered badly. Basic values were challenged. With millions desperate, it was easy for demagogues to offer simple explanations and solutions, which therefore meant that the crisis was variously blamed on Jewish finance, things like the Versailles Treaty, the Weimar democracy, and also socialists. The crisis also helped provoke unrest, increased unrest in 1923, which we're going to look at later. However, despite the fact that millions of Germans lost their savings, radical right-wing groups didn't actually win mass support at this point. Also, the German state actually gained financially since it lost its debt, because the new currency meant a government debt of 150,000 million marks was reduced to 15 pfennigs. So you can see there how their debt has instantly been taken away. However, the Weimar Republic was weakened politically since the great financial losses that people had suffered turned many of them against the democratic regime. Also, health too suffered, especially among the elderly, as a result of inflation-induced poverty, and this also was blamed on the Weimar government. The hyperinflation crisis therefore inflicted wounds that in the long term contributed to the Weimar's death.